Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. We're letting a few more folks join onto the webinar. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's science session, Fires in the Materials Management Sector, Key Findings and Implications. I am Susie Boxman. I'm the Director of Programs at the Environmental Research and Education Foundation, and I'm very excited to be sharing this work with you all today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So you can submit questions anytime through the presentation using the Q&A icon that's at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who are joining us live, tomorrow you will receive an email from Zoom with a link to both the presentation and a survey where you will be able to download your certificate of attendance. So in today's webinar, we're going to be exploring the critical findings of EREF's recent report on fires in the materials management sector. We're going to be discussing the prevalence of fires, common causes, including the growing risk of improperly discarded lithium-ion batteries, and discuss some of the implications for facility safety and management practices. I'd also like to introduce Alyssa Knowlton, who will be covering the most of the presentation. Alyssa is a programs project manager here at EREF. She joined EREF in 2023 and has since led projects on MRF fires, food packaging, tip fee reporting, and economic and industry data collection. Prior to EREF, she held a number of sustainability roles in Florida and North Carolina. So just to kick things off and provide a little bit of background, EREF started doing this work in 2019 as we were hearing from stakeholders that there was this growing trend of fires occurring at different types of solid waste management facilities. And while there was some information available or some information that was becoming available on these, getting more information about how frequently these fires were occurring, the scale of the fires, and how they were being managed was a big gap in understanding. So we worked to collect this information. At the time, the severity of the fires were ranging from small to catastrophic, where there were a number of different total facility losses that occurred. And understanding why and what caused these catastrophic losses was a big question, because when there is a catastrophic loss, there's not much left to be able to figure out what was the original cause. But there was a variety of anecdotal evidence that we were seeing and hearing about, suggesting that lithium-ion batteries were one of the main issues that was contributing to this increase in fires. I think we've continued to hear that anecdotal evidence about lithium-ion batteries, and certainly I think most of the folks on this webinar are familiar with the number of lithium-ion batteries that you personally interact with on a daily basis has certainly grown over the last few years. So there's certainly a plausible correlation between more lithium-ion batteries and more fires. So with that little bit of background, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa, who's going to really walk through what we found in this report.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susie, for the introduction and background on the report. Really excited to share what we found with everyone today. So we are just going to jump right on in. Now, this is something that Susie mentioned as well. When we were pulling this data and conducting this report, we understood that there were other reports coming available or other organizations also conducting the same research at this time. So this is actually a table from the report itself. We did want to highlight those other organizations who had also published published reports having to deal with fires in the waste industry. And so this is really just showing kind of how EREF in our report compares to those other organizations. Specifically for EREF, we want to highlight that our data does come from surveying directly the facilities that have experienced these fires. And then as you can see also at the bottom, the kind of different data that we reported on. The EREF report includes estimated fires data, external response data, which we'll talk about momentarily, estimated cost data, and then lithium-ion batteries, which will come up multiple times. As you can see, all other reports that we discussed also have to deal with lithium-ion batteries. So with all of these reports in the report itself, in the EREF report specifically, we do have a lot of further discussion about how their data compares to our data. So if you are further interested in kind of learning about that, you can check out the report. This is all we'll chat about in the presentation today. So jumping right into those survey methods that we just talked about. So we collected our data via an online survey that was sent to MRFs, metal recyclers, and transfer stations. And we collected those facilities from some of our own personal EREF facility lists, REMA members, as well as utilizing NWRA and SWANA contacts to send out that survey. And there were two separate surveys that we utilized and pulled data from. So phase one collected broad information about facilities and the numbers of fires that they experienced, while phase two was a more concerted effort to get information about the variety of fires experienced by those facilities. And before we really get into the data, I think this is important to define how we are defining fires within the EREF report, because there can be a wide variety, as Susie just covered, of fires and their severity. So specifically within this report, we will largely say fires, and that really includes every single stage of a fire. So whether it's just a smoking and smoldering event to a full-blown catastrophic fire, fires is kind of a total amount when we just say fires. Now, incipient fire is a term that is pretty well known also when talking about fires within the waste industry. And so these are just fires that are at the beginning stages of burning. So they're often small enough to be contained by in-house methods, as opposed to what we have defined as an external response fire, which is not able to be controlled by those in-house suppression methods. So, professionals like a fire department are required to then come out to the facility and be able to handle those fires. So that's kind of how we differentiate more extreme fires within the survey. We don't have a ton of data specifically on incipient fires. It is more so included within that total fire classification. So when we completed the survey, just starting from the highest level, we had two reporting periods in that initial survey, and the results showed that most facilities experienced at least one fire during two different timeframes that we surveyed on, which you can see with the figure on the left. So 75% of facilities experienced at least one fire between 2019 and 2020. And then 89% of facilities between 2014 and 2020 experienced at least one fire. So there was only about a 14% difference between these two timeframes. The 1-year timeframe is almost as high as that 5-year period. So we think that this suggests that the frequency of fires reported within the recent single year period is approaching the cumulative frequency of the fires reported over that longer 5-year time period, which could indicate that the fires are increasing. And then the table on the right is demonstrating the average fire per year per facility based on our surveyed data. So an important note is that survey respondents did not report discrete numbers of fires in the survey, they provided ranges like 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. So using those ranges for the year of 2019 to 2020, we did some math and were able to estimate a categorical range of fires per year per facility, which is what this table is showing. So you can see that transfer stations per year per facility are experiencing 5 to 8 fires on average, MRFs having the second highest at 3 to 6 per year per facility, and then metals recyclers having the least amount of fires on average. And then this is once again with us talking about the external response data, which again is indicating a more severe fire because that outside fire department help is required to extinguish that fire. So once again, we just discussed that in the 2014 to 2020 data, we already saw that 89% of facilities experience at least one fire. And then this figure further shows that 44% of those facilities that experienced a fire during that time frame also required external assistance because that fire was a larger event. So about half of the fires that we saw within this time frame were considered more severe than maybe your incipient fire. And we were able to further break this down per facility type that responded to our survey. So we'll just first look at the percentage of facilities that reported once again at least one fire during this time frame. So MRFs had the highest percentage with 97% of facilities reporting at least one fire. Transfer stations were close behind with 91% of facilities. And then metal recyclers were the least likely to experience a fire, but 74% still reported at least one fire over that 5-year time frame. And then when we look at all of the fire incidents that required an external response, transfer stations actually had the lowest at 24%, which could indicate that fires at these facilities were frequent but small, right? And could be handled by operators or in-house options, and they were caught relatively quickly. MRFs were most likely to be handled in reporting. MRFs were more likely to be experiencing fires that required an external response at about half, at 56%, from 2014 to 2020. And then while metal recyclers were less likely, they both required an external response at about half the time, with metals recyclers requiring them about 46% of the time. We also surveyed facilities on what kind of materials and streams they accept at their facility. So that is what these figures are demonstrating, that specifically these facilities experience, once again, at least one fire. So while we hoped that asking materials processed would provide some insight into the specific material that might be more likely to cause a facility fire, as we see with these figures, they kind of demonstrate that there isn't one specific material or type of facility that is more likely to have a fire, and they're all experiencing them at the relatively the same frequency. And we think that this is probably highlighting that the materials accepted are not consistently the problem, but improperly sorted materials coming in from the public, maybe poor management of those accepted materials might be more likely the cause than any of these specific materials overall. Lastly, we also asked if metal recyclers and transfer stations specifically accepted e-waste or batteries. So this figures is looking at the facilities that accepted these items and then what percent of them experienced at least one fire. The similar rates of fires between accepts and does not accepts for e-waste and batteries at metal recyclers is interesting and could indicate that neither e-waste nor batteries are the sole cause of fires, and that there may be other materials responsible when you're looking at a metals recycler facility. Transfer stations, on the other end, kind of had this interesting dynamic where if they reported they accepted e-waste and batteries, they actually had a lower incident of fire compared to the transfer stations that do not accept these materials. And we think that this suggests that transfer stations that know that they're accepting these potential volatile materials, they actually might implement additional safety measures to prevent them when they are coming in. And transfer stations that are maybe not as well versed, they don't expect them, they might be lacking some of those safety measures. All right, so another large part of the report is trends in fire prevention. So we also wanted to see how facilities in recent years, if fires are becoming more common, right, how are they able to combat them? And one of the things that we looked at is fire tracking practices. So we can see here that about 30% of the surveyed facilities track their fires internally on a voluntary basis. Only 6% of facilities were required to record fire incidences based on their company policy. But over half, at 58% of the facilities that we surveyed, estimated the reported fires based on experience and observation alone, which is interesting. This suggests that a large portion of facilities are not tracking their fire occurrences daily when the survey was completed. 6% of facilities had multiple tracking records or methods, predominantly both voluntary and required. And then at the time of the survey, only one surveyed facility was required to track fire incidences based on law. And at the time of the survey, once again, none were required to track by a third party like insurance. We also asked about what kind of strategies these facilities are utilizing if they do have a fire or fire suppression methods. So as we can see here, at 98%, portable fire extinguishers is the most common and it is available across most facilities. With a few exceptions, OSHA requires that portable fire extinguishers are present and readily accessible by employees. So this indicates that most of the facilities that we surveyed are in compliance with OSHA standards. The remaining prevention and suppression techniques are not required by safety standards, but you can see there's actually still a good amount, which indicates that facilities are kind of going above and beyond to try to protect their facilities and employees. So of the other strategies that are not required, you can see that 24-hour monitoring, smoke detection devices, and automatic sprinkler systems were all used by more than 50% of the facilities that we surveyed. And then based on all of the techniques that we just discussed, we see that most facilities are not just relying on only one of these methods, with 88% of the facilities using a combination of two or more, which is great. They're utilizing a lot more. They see that they might not necessarily overlap, so having more at their disposal is best. And 4 seems to be the magic number, with the most facilities utilizing that amount at 32%. The next portion of the report, which might be what everyone is excited to hear about, is the anatomy of the facility fires. So really looking into the details of what facilities could provide for us for causes. So EREF provided the survey respondents with a list of 20 potential causes to select from as the suspected causes for the fires, as well as an other category for respondents to fill in case the cause did not match the pre-available causes provided. An additional 17 causes were provided by respondents that did not fit within the suggested categories. Because fires can often destroy the item responsible for igniting it, like Susie mentioned, confidently identifying a cause can also be very difficult. So to account for that, we also offered a cause not identified option in the survey, which, as we can see, cause not identified was actually the top cause, if you will, of the suspected causes of fires at 36%. Fires with an unknown cause were also more likely to require an external response, meaning there were probably larger fires at 13%. Now, when we start to look at the causes that they were able identify, none of us are probably surprised that small discarded batteries were the greatest cause of fires, of identifiable causes, with 13% attributed to small batteries like those in consumer electronics. However, only about 1% of fires caused by these small batteries required an external response. And then just some other interesting things that this figure shows is hot loads and arson. While they're less likely to cause a fire overall, the data showed that they actually required more external responses than other identifiable causes. And then the last thing that I want to point out about this figure is the diversity of events that can cause a fire is reflected in the large number of responses that were less than 1%, which you can see at the bottom of the graph. So collectively, about 9% of the fires were unique events, as represented by that other category. Each unique cause encompassed in the other category was experienced by 3 or fewer facilities. And some of the suspected causes that didn't necessarily cause fires but were submitted for this category were things like poor maintenance or poor housekeeping of equipment, discarded chemicals or hazardous waste, as well as larger discarded batteries like maybe appliances. But really, this, I think, highlights the large percentage of fires that had other causes. And, it highlights the challenges faced by operators to identify and then reduce the likelihood of those different causes coming into their facilities. Now, we did ask respondents if their fire was caused by a battery, were they able to tell us what kind of battery that was? So when we sent out this survey, we use the battery options and classifications that you see on the left side. So auto battery, AA batteries, unknown, large rechargeable, and small rechargeable. But now there has been, I think, a lot of movement within the space of identifying and really trying to classify what kind of batteries are consumers are purchasing. Specifically, the EPA has well-defined battery scopes. So we did want to include this in the presentation today so that if you are familiar with the EPA battery scopes, you can kind of see how they correlate with what we asked in the survey for batteries. But when we start looking at the actual data for facilities that reported a fire was caused by battery, 77% were attributed to small rechargeable batteries, like a cell phone, and 11% were due to those larger format, like a computer or a scooter. 8% was unknown, which was kind of interesting. Probably also fits within the large or small rechargeable battery. And then we had a few auto batteries as well as AA. All right, the last little bit of the anatomy of the fire is looking at the location. So the results indicate that the tipping floor is the most common location for fires, with 27% of fires occurring there. Similar to the causes of fires that we just discussed, the locations provided by the survey were variable, with a total of 68 different locations identified. Since the locations were pretty specific to the facility, the actual number of fires that occurred at each of these locations was small. But we can once again see the large number of other locations at the bottom of this figure that was identified 19%, which again highlights the kind of the challenges and diversity that are seen in handling fires across facilities. Now, an important thing to note is that although there's a ton of locations here and a lot more locations obviously somewhat identified in the other section, when we actually start to look at the mechanism of some of these locations, we can actually see that there is a trend within the data. So Um, Similar functions, right? So any type of shredding or crushing was most likely to cause a fire, and that can be shown by the baler, the drum feeder, shredder, compactor, crush pad, or shred pile. And once we compile all of those kind of within like a mechanical category, that comes to a total of 27% of reported fires. So I think that's also a well-defined theme throughout the report. All right, one of the last sections in the report was looking at the estimated damages that facilities were able to provide if they had a fire. So, based on the responses to the survey, most fires did not result in property damage. A total of 87% of facilities had no damage whatsoever. 2% of fires that did result in serious damage were due to things like small discarded batteries, unknown causes, mobile equipment, or arson. Excuse me. However, as we can see in this graph, when the fire department responded to the fire, right, that meant that there was an increased chance for damages because once again, that means that these fires are probably larger. The only fires that resulted in serious damage occurred when the fire department responded, and then ultimately the fire department had to extinguish that fire as well. So respondents were also asked to provide a monetary value for the estimated damages, which include direct and indirect, damages. So direct damages include smoke and fire damage, equipment loss or property loss. Indirect damages include the associated downtime that would come like if the facility was not operational or needed to undergo repairs. So facilities were asked to estimate the dollar value associated with both of those categories for the fires that they reported. So once again, considering the figure that we just looked at and that most of the EREF survey responses indicated fires resulted in no damages, the most facilities similarly reported no direct damage costs associated with those reported fires. For the facilities that did report a dollar value for direct damages, the majority were valued at less than $10,000. No facilities valued the direct damages of reported fires in excess of $300,000. Now, it is important to note that we did have 2 fires reported at total losses. However, those facilities did not provide a dollar figure for those losses. So, unfortunately, they are not represented within this data. But similar to the dollar value of direct damages, the majority of facilities did not report indirect damage costs associated with these fires. The value of indirect damages was typically lower than those of direct damages, with only one facility reporting indirect damages valued between $100,000 and $200,000. So when we look at the average combined cost of direct and indirect losses based on our survey responses, they came to a total of $4,829. And as you can see, the average direct losses at around $3,000 is about double what we were seeing for indirect losses. Oops. So, an important thing that we want to end on, and an important piece that we later added to the report, is a current fire trend. So, when we were analyzing the data and writing the report, it became very apparent that our 2020 and earlier data might be showing trends that we were not comfortable publishing without kind of a caveat. Anecdotally, we were hearing that fires were occurring a lot more frequently than maybe what our 2020 data was showing. And we certainly didn't want to potentially undermine the complexity of fires within this space. So to combat that, we conducted informal interviews with facility owners and operators, and they showed very insightful things, including that facilities are experiencing on average a fire per week, which is granted more than what we were showing with our surveyed information. And every facility actually largely has the same definition of what a fire is, meaning they are also counting any type of fire, from a smoking, incipient small fire to a larger fire where a fire department might be required. Those incipient beginning stage fires are quickly spotted by employees and then quickly extinguished. They've become very well versed in identifying those. Work is rarely stopped, or if it is, it's resumed very, very quickly. They know how to identify them and then use those in-house suppression methods to stop the fire. Along those same lines, multiple facilities, or all facilities, excuse me, have multiple forms of fire detection and suppression technologies. I would say that's probably only increased since we did the survey. They are very aware that these are beneficial to them in their facilities and have implemented them frequently. However, not all facilities are tracking their fire data. It depended facility by facility. Some track every single occurrence, and some only reported tracking when maybe they were having more frequent fires than they were before to try and find the cause. But similar to our data, once again, facility owners identified the tipping floor as having the most fires. And then additionally, batteries. Every owner identified batteries as pretty much being what is causing all of their fires today, and really highlighted the need for proper disposal and better awareness so that they can, stop coming into facilities that do not accept them. And then lastly, a lot of facilities are hesitant to share detailed data on this topic due to increased insurance cost concerns, which is completely understandable, but it does also further increase some knowledge gaps within this space, because then it is hard to get concrete data and evidence for what these facilities are experiencing. So, rounding out some key conclusions that we think this report provides. So, fires at MRFs, metal recyclers, and transfer stations are common, with 75% of facilities experiencing at least one fire between 2019 and 2020. Though external response fires are not always required, so they're not always having these very severe fires. And the increasing ability to combat these fires in-house has then led to little to no damage to facilities, though of course total losses still occur and can obviously cause significant financial and operational challenges. The low fire department involvement actually then kind of indicates fewer large fires, which are the events that actually get reported more so in the media. And then any media-based reports are just using what's online as well. So this report shows a higher frequency of fire occurrences, especially those smaller events that often get overlooked by media, helping to kind of reduce that knowledge gap of how many fires are actually occurring. And then lastly, unidentifiable causes, as we discussed, were the most frequently reported cause, just because facilities can have a hard time identifying what is causing the fires. However, lithium-ion batteries are the leading identified cause, which I think we are all aware of as well. And even when they're not identifiable, most facilities are pretty confident that some form of battery is what initially caused the fire. And with that, we also want to say that this report is published on our site. So if you are interested in reading more about it, and there's certainly more figures and discussion within the report that we did not share today, then this QR code will directly take you to that report if you are interested in reading a little bit more. And with that, I think we are ready for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. That was really a great summary of the report. Appreciate that. So we do have some questions coming in into the chat. Please drop those into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we are able to. I think to kick things off though, we got a few questions submitted ahead of the webinar. And so I was going to run through a couple of those. So Alyssa, one of the questions we got in before the webinar was a question about whether or not vapes are much of a fire risk, or whether e-bike or e-scooter batteries are a contributing factor to fires.
Yes, absolutely. So vapes is an interesting one. I think if we had more recently conducted the study, that would have absolutely been something that was included. But when the survey was sent out, it just didn't seem like it was as much as an issue. I think vape use has certainly increased in recent years. And so, yes, there's a lot of reports and information coming out now that are saying that they actually might be some of the greatest causes that are coming into these facilities just because people are not properly disposing of them. I like to think that like an e-bike is kind of harder to end up at a transfer station or a MRF, but that doesn't mean that the battery won't. So yes, I mean really anything that's going to have a lithium-ion battery could, you know, cause issues for these facilities, unfortunately.
So one other question that came in before that I think was on one of the slides was how common are fires caused by aerosol cans? And I think when you went through the list of different causes, I did see aerosol cans on there. I don't know if you want to go back to that slide for a second.
Sure, yes. Not as frequent as others. Let me scroll back really quickly. Um, yep, right here. So it looks like it's about 5% of fires caused by aerosol cans, which, I mean, considering there is such a wide variety, like that's probably a good amount of facilities that are citing it as an issue. But interesting, does look like that no external responses were required when an aerosol can cause the fire. So maybe it means that they're pretty easy to handle.
All right, I think I'm gonna jump to some of the questions in the chat. So another one that should be pretty straightforward to cover is, can you cover again what is included in indirect losses?
Yes, I can also scoot back to that slide if that helps. So you can see a visual. So direct losses is really just any direct loss to that facility, right? So equipment loss, damage to the actual facility, so fire or smoke damage, or, you know, unfortunately, if it was a catastrophic fire, that would be any type of like property or full building loss.
And while we're talking about damages, I know that this was included in the survey, but I don't know if you know offhand, how many of these fires resulted in any employee injuries?
That is a good question. I do not know if I know that off of hand. Um, I don't think it was many, which is always a positive. But that would certainly be an interesting addition.
Yeah, as I recall, we did have a specific question related to whether or not there was any worker injuries, and it was very small, I think pretty much non-existent, at least for the facilities that reported in our survey. That doesn't mean that those injuries aren't happening, it's just
Sure.
not reflected in the data that we collected. Um, Another one that I know we had a question on, but I don't know, but it wasn't necessarily covered in the report of, is there any data relating to the time of day, whether it was during the day or at night of the fires, particularly for the total loss fires?
Hmm. Yeah, I am not, it's interesting. I don't remember anything in terms of that from the survey unless you do, Susie.
So yeah, as I think part of the reason we didn't explore it further is that there was no relationship between the time of day of the fires, based on the information that we had available. Let's see. So here's a little bit more of a complicated one. Um, For the fires reported by MRFs, do you think that those numbers are somewhat inflated because MRFs are consumers frequently assume that MRFs are going to be taking care of those fires or that they're going to be responsible for recycling those batteries?
Absolutely. I mean, I think wish cycling is a huge part of that, right? I mean, people have largely no idea on where certain things need to go. And so they don't necessarily want to throw it in the trash. So they're just going to hope for the best and put that in the recycling bin, which will then, of course, end up at MRFs. So MRFs, unfortunately, do see a wide variety of items, especially when they're not readily accepting those items that would be responsible for the elevated risk of fire that we see there.
And so, in thinking about the batteries, did we see any correlation between the size of the battery and the size or the severity of the fire?
Um, I would say an inverse correlation, actually, just because our data does show that those small discarded batteries are more likely to cause fires overall. And then once we looked at the fires that did have more serious damage, small discarded batteries were some of the highest causes for those fires that were more severe. And my thought would just be that they're smaller. You know, you might be able to see a larger battery. It probably will also not get, crushed as much. It might kind of make it through the system without causing as much damage. As opposed to a smaller battery, it will probably be harder to see. Employees might not be able to recognize it and get it out of there before it causes an issue. So yeah, I mean, at least our data is looking like those smaller batteries were causing more of an issue for the facilities.
Hmm. So one other question that we got in before the webinar about solutions to prevent or detect and remove lithium-ion batteries. Is there anything that you can speak to related to how we can remove the batteries before they get into the waste stream?
Absolutely. So that was not necessarily a part of the survey that we sent out to facilities. However, as we've been doing the report, we have heard of a lot of different potentials. If the batteries do get to these facilities, how are ways that they can, stop them from, maybe getting off of the tipping floor and going further into the system where they can cause problems. So we have seen things like X-ray and AI can kind of be used conjointly, where it kind of looks like airport security, I think is a good analogy, right? The trash is taken on a conveyor belt. It goes through an X-ray, and then the AI is then able to kind of identify, and someone will get pinged if there is something that looks like a battery. Um, I think a lot of this technology is still new and in the works, and it's probably costly for a lot of facilities. But it will be interesting to see, I think everyone has established that lithium-ion batteries are a real issue and that there have to be certain steps that are taken to reduce the fires that they are causing. So it will be interesting to see if these current technologies are able to be implemented on a widespread scale, and or if there are new things that kind of come to be in recent year or future years.
Mm. So I think two more questions. Sorry if there's background noise. There's a lawnmower over here. Oh, here's a new one that just came in. Um, Oh, I don't know if we can speak to this. With the incipient fires and the increase of battery fires, would you recommend controlling the fire via a compressed air foam unit rather than an ABC fire extinguisher?
I do not probably know enough about that type of fire extinguishing method to comment on that. But that is interesting. I know, right? I mean, it kind of depends on um the material that is causing the fire and what fire extinguisher to use. But that might be someone who's working in the MRF who can better answer what they're utilizing.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think that that actually could relate to, so there's a question as to whether or not there'll be a follow-up survey. I think, in answer to that, there's not necessarily a plan for a follow-up survey right now at this moment. But if there continues to be a need related to growing concerns around fires and continues to be uncertainty over what's causing the fires, I think that that could potentially be something that EREF might look into. And then the last question I have right now is asking whether there was a reason why landfills were not included in the survey. And I think just when we started this effort, they were not, not that they aren't experiencing fires or that lithium-ion batteries and those sorts of causes aren't a concern for landfills. It just wasn't necessarily the focus of these efforts. So they were excluded for that reason. Um, so unless anybody has any other questions that they want to pop into the Q&A, I think we've really covered most of the ones that were relevant from the pre-webinar. I'll give it another minute to see whether or not anybody has another question. Otherwise, I think we can go ahead to the last slide, Alyssa, and say that this concludes a EREF science session for today. We'd like to thank Alyssa for her time and expertise, and to all of you for joining us today. We hope that you can join us again on June 4th for our Scholar Spotlight with EREF scholar Jenny Ding, who's going to be covering her work optimizing volatile fatty acid yield and anaerobic co-digestion of food waste. Please look for an email tomorrow from Zoom with links for the presentation and a brief survey where you can download your certificate of attendance. We appreciate your feedback to help us improve our science sessions. Thank you once again for attending, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.